So once I've completed my armature, I'm ready to paper mache. So here's what I need. First, something to protect your work surface. So an unfolded box would work, a piece of newspaper, a few layers would be great. Second, you need your mache, which is really glue. So something to hold that in. A brush might be useful, some water, and then most recipes call for either just like standard white glue or flour. And so I tend to go with flour, but it depends on what you have available to you. So if I'm using flour, I would do equal parts. So like 1 part flour, and I'm just going to eyeball it. It doesn't have to be exact, but if you want to, you can certainly measure it a little more accurately. 1 part flour to 1 part water. And you can mix this by hand, right, with a spoon or a fork or with a brush. If you use a brush though, please make sure that this paste will really mess it up. If you let it dry, it's very difficult to remove later. Same thing with glue. So while you're working with this, when it's not in here, if you have it in a cup of wet water just to keep it from drying out, that's going to make cleanup so much easier. So I'm going to mix it up potentially with my brush, and you want to go for kind of like a heavy cream consistency. So something like this, I might make it a little bit thicker. So you can, of course, kind of adjust to your own preferences, but you don't want like a goopy, thick mess, right? So it still needs to be liquidy enough that you can brush it on or layer it on. So this is a really great consistency here. So you can see when I kind of scrape it off that it sort of runs down the sides. And then you need something to, some sort of paper, right? So paper mache. So if you have newspaper, that is a very traditional use material, right? So newspaper would work, and you want to tear it into strips. So depending on the newspaper type, it'll tear easily in one direction but not the other. So see here, it's kind of tearing roughly. So I would try, before I continue, to tear the opposite way. And you can see it tears so much easier. So find the grain line, the way that it wants to tear, and tear along that grain line, and give yourself some nice strips. Now I probably won't go with this big of a strip just because I have a fairly small sculpture. So I tend to go with maybe like smaller segments, right? Now if I didn't have newspaper, alternative options would be, and newspaper could be a lot of different things. So if you get any of those like mailer ads, those often are made out of newsprint, which is the same thing as newspaper. A paper bag could work. It's a little bit thicker, so you'll probably need a few more kind of like layers of paste, but just tearing the bag, that would work. Or on the slightly thinner side, but still similar, if you get packages that are wrapped in paper wrapping, sometimes it's brown, sometimes it's just like off-white, which is, this is basically newsprint, or if sometimes I've seen green, other colors, these are great as well. They're a little bit thinner than a regular paper bag, so they absorb the paper a little bit better and wrap around your shape more. Or your cardboard actually could work. So if you did have cardboard, the corrugated kind, if you peel away that top layer, you could use this in a pinch. If you have coffee filters, make sure that they are able to be used, because these might be really precious in your household, right? Don't take them from somebody who is really needing their coffee. Or maybe wrapping tissue paper, but this is really thin, right? So it's going to get really fiddly and tear very easily. So this I would choose as maybe my like last resort. Also make sure that it's not a really dark color, because that will bleed through. On a note of color, if you're planning to paint your piece, which usually you want to, you don't want to see the newspaper covering. If you're using, say, a neutral color like this, maybe you don't want to color it all the way. But if you're using something like newspaper, you would probably, if you don't have a lot of white paint or thick paint to cover it, you might want to do your last layer with some sort of white paper. I would not use white printer paper, because I find that that has like a protective coating and that keeps it from really sticking. So if you can find something a little more absorbent, maybe a paper towel, maybe that coffee filter comes into play. Maybe this is when you do want to use tissue paper. One note, if you're using things from newspapers or a mailer, don't use the glossy kind. So you can see this one has a sheen to it. This won't stick because it's got that protective coat that keeps the glue and the paste from sticking. So I've got my armature, I've got my paper, and I have my paste. Oh, and if you aren't using flour, if you do use white glue, you do want to thin it down. You don't want to use it straight from the bottle. So you are looking for the similar consistency from here. So you would just do the same, like equal parts of glue and flour. And I believe you can also cook up like rice and create a rice paste. And if that's the case, I will follow up with information on that. You can also use woodworking glue if you didn't have regular white glue. So I'm going to take my armature, my paste, and my paper, and you could certainly just dip this and apply it, or if you would prefer, you can use a brush and just brush on and then start layering over. And as you're layering, you want to make sure that you're covering all the crevices, so don't leave a piece sticking up because that's going to dry and be a little bit harder to fix later. So if you're wrapping around a curve, do you need to fold it over, right? I generally like around 4 layers all together. You're going to lose track, so just roughly, like kind of keep in mind, okay, am I doing about a layer today? That means I'm doing a layer tomorrow, and go from there. So you're going to just wrap around. The important thing with paper mache is that you're not layering them all in the same direction, because then you actually don't have as much strength. If you overlap them, then you're starting to really knit that paper together and give it more strength, right? If I'm bridging an area, then I might want to have a slightly longer piece to give it more strength so that it can go from like one side to the next instead of trying to paste a lot of little pieces together. So you would just keep going in this direction until you've gotten your 4 layers total. I usually will do maybe 2 or 3 in a day and then let it dry, and then my 4th or maybe 5th layer, again, you might lose count. My last layer would be what I call my beauty coat, and that is, like I mentioned before, if you don't have access to like a paint that can cover all of this kind of distracting, you know, newspaper color and text and everything, it might be a white or off-white or brown or, you know, some sort of like single color that you would cover it. But also you want to make sure that you're paying attention to laying it down. So you can see in some areas like here, there's a slight gap, and you know, you'll see that when you paint over it. So making those last layers to really press them down really carefully so that they fully are nice and seamed, so that you don't see, you know, those areas that they're overlapping. It just gives it a much neater and cleaner look, right? And so then when you've done that, finished that beauty coat, you need to let it dry. Depending on the humidity and how many layers you have, it might take a while. And then after that, you will prime it, and you can prime it with a lot of different materials. Again, perhaps you're doing that just with the paper itself. Maybe you're using some sort of like gesso, which is just like a white layer to create a neutral painting surface. Or if you have house paint would be great. It really depends on what you have access